this point, our speakers will engage in some dialogue. We will start with Dr. Shermer, who will ask the first question. This will go on for several minutes, and then I'll ask Mr. D'Souza to question Dr. Shermer. Following the previous monologue, we do ask, clearly this is these are topics that are near and dear to all of our hearts, one side and the other, but please hold back your passions, make your seat twitch, but don't let your voice come out. So with that, and notice we didn't include any stones on the stage either. So anyway, Dr. Shermer, please initiate this for us.
So how about those Packers this weekend? So Dinesh, I guess my first question is a philosophical one. Do moral standards purportedly set down by God exist separately from God? If so, then belief in God is not necessary, right? And if no, then those moral standards are subject to the whims of God, and that's why we see all these differing moral stories in the Old Testament. So in matters of human law, we can abide by a law without any knowledge of or belief in its author. Why can't the same be true of divine law?
Well, I would agree with you that moral standards are embedded, if you will, within human nature itself. They are embedded within human nature, I think, by God. In part, I say that because I cannot think of any evolutionary explanation for morality. Now, I realize there's a whole body of evolutionary scholarship, as you noted, trying to show why people benefit others who share their genes. I'm familiar with all that. But if I were to get up to give someone a seat in a bus who's nothing to me, or if, as in the Bible, the man helps the Samaritan who's a complete stranger, or if you donate blood without any hope of recompense, or if you say, give me liberty or give me death, or if you say, love thy neighbor, these ideas, it seems to me, can't be explained by an extended form of selfishness. So, can you practice them without resort to God? Sure, but who put them there? I think God did.
So if I could convince you that there was a good evolutionary model, would you concede that it's possible God used evolution to create the moral sentiments within humans?
I would certainly concede that that's possible, yes.
Okay, chapter 7 of this book here will get you there. Anyway. Because I do think there are good, but it would take too long. We can do that in the Q&A. And along these lines of Old Testament, New Testament moralities, assuming that these moral principles really exist there somewhere, given to us by God, how do you know what they are?
Well, I think that, the first thing to note about this is that morality is a human thing. Would you agree with me that there is no human species or group that is outside of morality? Morality is human, correct?
Yes, I would say the best we could get with primates is sort of pre-moral.
Now, Donald Brown has a study called Human Universals, the anthropologist, in which he describes more than 300 things that all humans from whatever culture have in common. This alone, I think, is an adequate refutation of sort of an extreme form of relativism that holds that essentially morality is purely individual or purely a matter of one group or the other group. He shows no, although that may be true at the margin, the core elements of human nature include a moral dimension, and he specifies very clearly what those are. So, if something is universal, has existed in all cultures, it seems to me that that is a good case for saying that that is part of our nature. Why else would it have developed everywhere? If you look at the moral rules and ask this question, which I also ask about physical laws, which is to say, how can you have laws without a lawgiver? There's nothing in our experience that would suggest that it's possible for immaterial things. I mean, there's nothing in our experience that says that this bottle of water has intention and purpose and can follow rules. If you have rules, whether the rules of nature, which can be called science, or the rules of human nature, either way, I think there is strong inferential evidence that these laws presume a lawgiver. Where else do they come from?
But how do you know what they are? I mean, divine revelation from God himself because you heard the voice, or
No.
read it in a holy
No,
text?
I would separate theology from morality. The principles of theology, for example, the Trinity. I think that's the province of revelation. I would never try to persuade you based on reason to accept the Trinity. On the other hand, the golden rule, that's a moral principle. I would defend it on the basis of reason. I think that reason itself has been implanted by God. I would be hopeful that I could convince a Hindu or a Buddhist or even an atheist that it's a good rule to follow. So in that sense, these moral principles are in our nature. The atheist isn't so much rejecting God. The atheist is turning away from the voice of conscience in himself and denying that aspect of God imprinted on him or on her.
But what I'm after here is sort of divine law, natural law, difference, and let's say within natural law, I would throw my own theory of evolutionary origins of the moral sentiment. Outside of natural reason, to get at natural law, how would you get at divine law? Short of asking and he tells you, or she tells you.
There is no way to get at divine law other than some version of God told me. So that's why when it comes to divine law, there is no way to argue for it on the basis of, you can say, secular reason. On the other hand, you can understand this better by looking at something concrete. Take the abolition of slavery, for example. I would say that you can't reasonably argue that there is an evolutionary argument for why you shouldn't have slaves. You know, as I do, that for millennia human beings have had slaves. It was there in all cultures. If evolution kicked against it, we wouldn't have it. We had it for a long time. How did it stop? It stopped by someone asserting a principle that you asserted repeatedly in your speech, the principle of human equality. Now I would ask you, where does that principle come from? I would argue, I say historically, it comes from a theological principle translated into a social principle. So here's a case where God is the author, but man posits a natural law rooted in the divine law, applies it to politics, and that law is so effective that today you, as an atheist, but you're still an atheist with a Christian morality, still argue for that principle in defending gay rights and defending anti-slavery and defending women, and you say the Christians will take credit for it. The Christians should take credit for it because the principle of equality is a Christian principle.
But then why are Christians not supporting gay rights and gay marriage?
Because in life there are moral propositions. Equality is one of them. Human dignity is another. But there are also injunctions against sins, immorality, and so on. So it's not the case. I mean, there are times when principles come into conflict. You want to respect someone's dignity, but you also feel that what they're doing is wrong, and you have to figure out some way to reconcile those competing principles.
It's based on that one passage, and surely you would not endorse execution for adulterous women and disobedient children, right?
Right.
So why hang on to the gay thing? Why hang on to the gay thing and dump the others? I mean, what's your criteria? What do you judge to say, okay, I'll take this one and dump the other one?
Well, let's explore this, Michael. I mean, if you look at marriage, I see four aspects of the definition of marriage. Okay, four parts of the definition. Part number one, marriage has to involve two people and no more. Number two, these two people have to be adults. They can't be children. Number three, these two people have got to be unrelated to each other. They can't be brother and sister, for example, incest. Number four, one has to be a man, the other has to be a woman. You want to uproot principle number four. Why do you want to preserve principles 1, 2, and 3?
Well, in Tennessee, no. I mean, if you take the Mormons, you can ask me that when it's your turn to ask questions. In Joseph Smith's theology, who fully accepted Christ as his Savior, he had a revelation from God. And then, in 1896, suddenly, after the U.S. government says, you're not going to be doing this anymore, there was a new revelation from God, in which they said, God changed his mind, apparently, about polygamy. Isn't this a classic example of Christianity following a cultural trend, not leading it?
Well, I understand that there's another new one coming out from Mitt Romney, but anyway.
Who's had fewer wives than Giuliani, but that's another.
Romney says he thinks marriage should be between a man and a woman, and a woman and a woman and a woman. I don't want to go down this road only because, in fairness, the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, would not be considered as being mainstream Christians. But the broader point I think you're getting at here is a good one, and that is that we are human beings struggling to intuit and figure out and determine something whose origins are divine. It doesn't surprise me that different religions struggle with this, come up with different ways to get at it. In Islam, for example, there is a respect for the traditional family, but you can take up to 4 wives. Now, Islam disagrees with Christianity on theology. The morality of the world's major religions is not far apart. In fact, Hans Küng, the liberal theologian, assembled what he called a parliament of world religions, and he got people to sit down on a round table, and most of the moral propositions they agreed with. And I would submit that even secular people would agree with most of them. So all of this is a way of saying that ultimately religion here is supplying a transcendent basis for morality, and something very important, I think, for us fallible human beings, which is the notion of an ultimate cosmic accounting. You know and I know we live in a world where bad people succeed and good people come to grief. Wouldn't we all act a little bit better in the world if we felt that ultimately what goes around does come around? We know that that's not true in life. When people say what goes around comes, they know that that's a lie. A lot of times the bad guy gets away with it, the good guy comes. So the idea that there is cosmic justice in the world and that at some time ultimately we will all get our comeuppance. I mean, that's a little bit of a scary idea, but in some ways it establishes fundamental justice in the world. I think religion has done a lot of good by cementing that idea in the human mind.
I would like that to be true, for the same reason I would like, well, when I'm asked what's my position on the afterlife, I always say, I'm for it, of course, I hope it's true. But what I know from psychology is that what I'd like to be true and what is true are not always the same. And it would be nice if there was an ultimate lawgiver where Hitler really doesn't get away with it. Yes, that would be nice. But I don't know that that's true, and I don't think anybody else does either, which is why we still have these debates. So short of that, we do need a legal system, do we not, to settle these things now in this world as best we can, just in case it's not all going to be settled in the next world. Therefore, the importance of politics.
Of course we do. But my point is simply that the legal system would be a sufficient incentive for a morality that said, I should do this as long as I don't get caught. Because if I'm caught, the legal system will make me pay. But let me ask you this, why should I do the good deed in the dark? Why should I do a good deed when I'm never going to be caught?
Okay, the answer to that is because it's not enough to fake and pretend being a moral person. Because in the evolutionary environment of our Paleolithic ancestors, where there were these small groups of a couple dozen to a couple hundred people. Everybody is either related to one another or knows one another very good, like any small town. Gossip spreads the information about who's moral and who's not. In time, if you are an opportunistic Machiavellian, you will be caught. People will know this guy is not to be trusted. In a huge anonymous society, like since we've lived in for the last 7,000 years or so, it's too easy to hide. So you need those codified rules. It just so happens that the first 2 organizations on the scene were government and religion. And they did the best they could to sort of make that happen. But what I'm saying, back then, when we spent 99% of our evolutionary history was in these small states, you really had to be moral, not fake it, not in the dark, I'm not going to obey the rules. Because if you don't believe it yourself, let me rephrase it, by believing it yourself, by actually living it, doing it, and believing it, by actually really being a good person, most of the time, being a moral person, that's the best way to convince other people you're moral, to actually be moral. So I think we evolved a deep moral sentiments, and I think Christianity got it right the same way Darwin did. We have if you want to call it a sinful side or whatever you want to call it, we have a dark, evil, nasty side. We're tribal and xenophobic, all those things. And given the chance, people often do the wrong thing. So that's why we need those rules. So to that extent, I think we're on the same page of our human nature, our sinful nature, good and evil. The only question is where to come from.
Right, so let's begin with a point of agreement, and then I will point out where you go wrong. The point of agreement is that the Darwinian picture of human nature and the Christian picture of human nature are quite similar. They both posit a selfishness built into human nature. And so I contrast both with what I want to call the liberal view of human nature, which is the benign view of human nature, that we have a sort of inner angel that will point us to doing the right thing in every case, that our human nature is in its essence good. I think we agree that we're dealing with the crooked timber of humanity. The problem I see it is this. I have a 12-year-old daughter. I want to teach her to do a lot of good things. For example, don't tell lies. If I were to say to her, honey, I don't think you should tell lies because your ape-like ancestors discovered that faking morality wasn't good enough. Not only should she look at me odd, but she would have a very crushing rebuttal. She would say to me, if this is part of my Darwinian programming, Dad, why do you have to teach it to me? I'm that way anyway. I already know, built into my genes, that I shouldn't tell lies. You don't need moral instruction here. This is part of my Darwinian nature. I would suggest no, our everyday human experience is not that. On the contrary, it is that left to its own devices, this Darwinian, or I would say Christian, human nature will wreck society and wreck the world. And this is why we have institutions, legal systems, moral instruction, universities, schools, to ultimately inculcate in young people something that doesn't come now. If morality is doing what comes naturally, we would not have to mention the subject at all. Any more than you don't have to tell me when I'm asleep to breathe. I can do that on my own.
If men were angels, we wouldn't need government. Yes, of course. So my answer is this, that most of the time, most people want to and do the right thing. The fact that the Enrons of the world and these kinds of events happen, make the news and make spectacular news, is because they are still relatively rare. As long as we have a rule of law in a society, and we need that because those informal rules of engagement and conflict resolution that work reasonably well in hunter-gatherer communities, where everybody knows one another and the tribal elders sit down with everybody and parents cultivate the moral sentiments within their children and so on. All that works fine without writing anything down, as long as it's pretty small. Once you're up into the thousands, there's too many ways to have violations. Okay? So the point of government and society and so on is because there's just too many people. So there is where religion sometimes does good, and I think Christianity figured out most of the major, like all the religions, not Christianity, Judaism really gets the credit for that, figuring out why too much gossip is dangerous, why infidelities, why violations of business contracts and friendships and so on. They figured out what's in our nature already, and since we can't ever settle on where it ultimately comes from, in that sense, then we can agree. And I guess the other answer to your question is, what would I tell my daughter? I have a 16-year-old, so I've had these sorts of conversations with her. And no, I don't give her the primate lecture, even though she's heard that in other contexts.
That's a rebuttal.
You just really start with the fundamentals of the golden rule, and how would you feel? I mean, she had kind of hurt her friend's feeling a few months ago, and I had to talk to her about this, and how would you feel if she had done that to you? And you just kind of basic stuff like that. And they get that. Of course, it helps to have a girl.
Let me press you on this a little bit, and maybe as a transition to my turn. So can I pick up after that?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Is it still on? Can you hear me? All right. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a lot of people chomping at the bit to ask you guys some questions too.
Okay, well, I haven't had my turn, and I can keep it brief.
Okay, yeah.
Just one or two knockout punches should do it. All right.
Okay, all right.
When we talk about, Michael, when we talk about morality, you're speaking as if you've got these human problems and religions have sort of come up with their own stuff. When I look at a set of moral rules, and I want to take, for an example, the UN Charter of Human Rights, a very specific set of 20 or so propositions. We have human dignity, the rights against torture, and it goes down the list. The right to marry and form a family, the right to practice. All right. Now what's interesting is, although this is the UN Declaration of Universal Rights, I think you would agree with me that these rights are not only not universally respected, they are not universally even cherished in most of the world's cultures and religions. In other words, these so-called human or universal rights are the specific property and were defended as the specific legacy of Christianity, universalized. So my point is, this is not a case of a society this is a case of something Christian in origin and universal in application, but I don't see the idea of universal human dignity in Hinduism or in Buddhism, do you?
Well, I'm not a big fan of the UN, so we're probably in agreement there. I think the American experiment is the right way to go. The pathway we've been going down, in which our founding fathers, who for the most part were deists, not Christians, came up with this brilliant idea that no matter what religion you are, or even if you're not even religious, and even if you're an atheist, these are still the values we hold dear, which they got from Locke and Rousseau and so forth.
Well, no, wait. They didn't get them from Locke. Locke may have articulated, but they said that they got them. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator.
Well, it says that in the Declaration of Independence. God does not appear in the Constitution.
That's true, but the Constitution is, if you will, the legal document that reflects the moral proposition of the Declaration.
Yes.
In other words, what is the source of the rights? Where would an inalienable right come from if not from God? Because all my rights that I possess are alienable, right? I own the right to my own labor, but I can sell it. Why can't I sell myself if I want to? Don't I own me?
Because we said so.
We.
Yeah.
He.
Yeah. Well, whoever he is.
Okay.
Or she.
Whoever he or she,
Yeah.
and maybe the commandment came to Salt Lake City, but my point is, where does it come from? Is it not a transcendent principle?
I think it is transcendent.
Can you give an evolutionary explanation for it?
Even without a God, it's still transcendent.
It is still transcendent.
I think so.
Okay.
Just by saying so.
Let me push you on this line of reasoning. I want to pick up with Darwin here. You said earlier that religion, it would be nice if it is true. And here I see you picking up an old tradition. We see it in Freud and Marx. The idea of religion is wish fulfillment, right? The idea that you wish it was true, and that's kind of why a lot of people believe. I want to suggest this. Wish fulfillment cannot survive Darwinian analysis because it can't be in our human interest to believe things that are manifestly untrue. Imagine the case of a rabbit being pursued by a lion. The rabbit says, I could run, but I shall not. There is another life waiting for me that is even better than this one. What would happen to such a rabbit? It would be promptly eaten. Rabbits that believed in afterlives would not survive. Therefore, what is the Darwinian explanation for wish fulfillment?
The premise, I don't agree with the premise, because I don't accept...
Let me interrupt just a second. If you'll answer this question, Dinesh is harder than anybody in the audience I've had to deal with before. So I'm going to have to go ahead and just put the kibosh on this after you give a brief answer to this, if you will, please.
Okay.
We're just getting started.
I know, I can tell, we're wrapping up.
That's fine.
You can have a few more minutes in the Q&A. I don't even buy the wish fulfillment explanation for religion. I don't think it's wish fulfillment, so I don't think it needs a Darwinian explanation. I think religion has its origins in other sources, and it's a big complex thing, as we've been talking about tonight. There's not a single explanation for religion. So I disagree with all my evolution friends.
May I pose one more question?
Wait, you said that a minute ago.
It's okay with me if you ask one more.
Well, okay, actually, in fact, this discussion is fairly rich, and I do wish to be dynamic in this, and so I know that a lot of folks are chomping at the bit, like I said earlier, to ask questions, but maybe if, by a raise of hands, if you would tell me if you would rather them continue for 2 more minutes, or to jump right to questions. Raise your hands if you wish to continue for 2 more minutes.
Okay.
Okay, all right.
Give me another one.
Thank you.
Bring it on.
It's Shermer and D'Souza against the moderator at this point. Okay. You said something that, on the surface of it, would be a little troubling to a believer, that by measures of social pathology, Christians, to put it in religious language, commit more sins than non-Christians.
Or at least don't do any better.
Or if you look at social pathologies, you find that states that are secular, like Massachusetts, have lower rates of divorce than states like Mississippi that are more religious. I think that's true, and actually I think that may suggest something very interesting about religion, which is that it draws people who feel that there is something broken in their life that needs to be fixed. The Bible is very consistent with this, the idea that the broken person is more likely to recognize the need for repair than the guy who's doing great. I think this is why the Bible says that it's hard for the rich guy to get to heaven, because the rich guy feels, I'm doing great. And so it doesn't surprise me entirely that broken people lean to Christianity. But I want to ask you this question. Would you not agree that the secular values that we find, for example, in Europe, the secular values we would find in Massachusetts, have themselves a Christian root? Here's what I mean. You made jokes earlier about pedophilia and so on. If I was talking earlier in my own speech about how we see Athens through the eyes of Jerusalem. You only have to go back and look at Athens without Jerusalem to realize that not just homosexuality, but pederasty was a normal part of life in Athens. And in fact, in Plato's Symposium, one of the characters even defends it, and not only defends it, he thinks that pedophilia is a little unfair to the older guy. This is the character. So what I'm getting at here is this. Isn't it true that the secular so-called values that you appeal to show the deficiency of the Christians, are themselves Christian? In other words, that Europe, although pagan perhaps or atheist in its current practice, is still inhabiting a culture formed by Christianity. See, this was the point the philosopher Nietzsche made. He said, look, he said, Western man thinks that you can kill God and keep everything else. You can kill God and keep Christian morality, keep equality, keep the idea of the family, keep the idea of compassion. Nietzsche said no. He said, you remove the foundation and the rest of it will stay for a while, a decade, a century, by habit, but eventually it'll start crumbling. And I would suggest that as our society has become more secular, we do see values newly introduced by Christianity, for example, the respect for human life, begin to erode at the edges. I mean, today no one would justify mass killing, but on the other hand, would it surprise you totally if 30 years from now people felt that once you are weak and frail and cannot support yourself, you have a duty to die? I can see a value like that creeping back into our society. If so, it would reflect the delayed legacy of the death of God, according to Nietzsche. So here's my point. How do you expect to preserve Christian morality without Christianity?
Okay. Well, that's a two-part question. The first part on the Paul study that I cited that you referenced. So I'll take out my debater's hat for a minute and put on my social science hat. It's not clear which way the causal vector goes, whether extreme religiosity in developed democracies leads to more STDs and abortions and so on, or whether those societal ills, perhaps driven by economic problems, and then those economic problems, let's say great disparity between wealth and poverty, leads more people to become religious, particularly on the lower economic strata. And that's what leads to this increase in religiosity. So this is what my liberal social science friends think is the explanation for that study, is that because America is not only yes, it's very religious, but there's also a huge, great disparity between the rich and the poor, and our safety net for those who fall through the cracks is not very good. Although conservatives think it's getting worse, it's going in the wrong direction. But nevertheless, so it's not clear to me which way the causal arrow goes. But whatever religion does, apparently it is not controlling for those sorts of things. Now, I'll give you a point that Hitchens makes in his book that he'll probably bring up if you ask him that question, and that is, even to the extent that parts of Christianity throughout history have gotten us to a certain level, the fact that we rode there on a horse doesn't mean we can't get off the horse and now start driving a car. That is the vehicle that gets you somewhere. That may just be true, but that doesn't mean we have to keep using that. So why not take the parts of Christianity and Judaism and all the other religions that we see have value, dump the ridiculous stuff, stoning to death disobedient children, all these other idiotic stories that we would no longer ever embrace today, and then move on and use the best we can, do the best we can. We're all on this journey together, trying to find answers to problems.
I don't think you have to resort to secularism to be able to see that even within morality there is development. In other words, I think there's nothing in Christianity that denies the idea of moral progress. Moral progress would basically refer to not the invention of a new principle, but a widening franchise of its application. And so, for example, the founders say all men are created equal, but that applies in a very narrow way. In the Civil War, that orbit is extended and slavery is abolished. In the Civil Rights Movement, another religious movement again, and again, a fairly recent one. My point is not necessarily the fact that Martin Luther King was a minister or something like that. It's rather that his argument is in and of its nature moral and religious.
But wasn't Gandhi his role model?
Yeah, but it was. But Gandhi got his own concept of nonviolence from Thoreau, and in other words, Gandhi himself leaned on Jesus and Thoreau. So you have a very interesting symbiosis here.
Yeah, right. So you take parts of this religion, and the culture moves forward. This sort of cultural zeitgeist continues to progress. Religion's part of it. Sometimes it contributes, sometimes it doesn't. Secularity sometimes contributes, sometimes doesn't. And we're just trying to struggle to do the best we can to, well, I guess to include...
Well,
here's what we're trying to do, I think, is we're trying to take the in-group and make it so big that there's no longer any out-group members, because that's the problem, is tribalism.
That notion of the in-group...
Dinesh.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Might the moderator be respected?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
Let's go for the...
Okay, sure. And in fact, this is quite a bit longer than I intended to go, but I appreciate you all expressing your opinion on where to go with it. At this point, though, I would like to take questions from the audience. Prior to doing so, and as you approach the microphone, please see that you adhere to what I request of you. Firstly, I do ask that you take time to carefully frame your question. Often writing it down helps. And please, in fact, I will cut you off if you continue dialogue. I will force you to obey the moderator. And so, with that being said, just one question. Please carefully frame it. And we do not permit statements. This is, of course, time for the scholars to speak and you to ask the questions. So, please, the microphones are at the front. Approach the front if you have a question, and I will call on you to ask the question.
Is this on?
Yeah, he'll turn it on. Go ahead. I think if you start talking.
Okay. Hello?
There you go.
Yes, first of all, I really do want to say that I'm an atheist for Jesus and spent 13 and a half years in the Bible Belt in Upper East Tennessee, and I can guarantee you that the Christians are relatively intolerant of atheists in that area, having lost friends after they found out I was an atheist. During the time of Jesus in Jerusalem, there was a lot of Jewish people who were fighting one another. And in fact, part of the reason I would consider myself an atheist for Jesus is Jesus was living in this time, and if you listen to what he says that in Matthew 23, he talks about the Pharisees, and these, of course, were Jewish people. So the pillars of Judaism out of which this come were people who were killing each other inside the walled cities in Jerusalem, and Jesus was really upset with the pillars of Judaism at that time. And
sir, please get to the question. I appreciate it.
Okay, so I want to ask you, with that sort of trouble in mind, and the fact that Hitler himself was really a Christian, how do you look at the Christian religion in some parts of it which have caused great trouble, and the Christian religion which in other parts has done well in the world?
Since my position on the Atheist for Jesus movement is one of mere mystification, I will zoom in to your proposition that Hitler was a Christian. You should read a book called Hitler's Table Talk, which is an extended discussion of Hitler's private statements, recorded diaries of Hitler as kept by his closest aides. Those are important because Hitler was in a largely Lutheran and partially Catholic country. Initially, Hitler tried to cut a deal with the churches, failed, and then relentlessly persecuted them. But you see from Hitler's Table Talk that he was very clearly a pagan, and by a pagan, what I mean is an atheist of this sort. The ancient pagans believed in Zeus and Baal. They believed in those gods. Hitler's paganism was secular. Ultimately, Hitler's commitment was to a racial ideology that was secular in nature, that sought to destroy the power of religion because he saw that power of religion as a competing force in society. You should read Richard Weikart's book, From Darwin to Hitler. The roots of Nazism were in two strains of thought. On the one hand, a social Darwinism, and on the other hand, a Nietzschean strain that exalted the Superman. I do not for one second think that Darwin or Nietzsche would have approved of Hitler. My point is that the Nazis approved of them and drew on these secular strains in order to concoct a fantastic and destructive ideology that first of all targeted the Jews, not for religious reasons, but for racial reasons, and the churches, which were the second target in Hitler's sights.
Excuse me, sir, I'm sorry. You're not allowed. This is not a dialogue. I'm sorry. In fact, thank you for the question. I'm sorry.
You read his early speeches.
Dr. Shermer, would you care to...
Well, my response is that, as I said, people are tribal and xenophobic and nasty in certain circumstances, and I think religion or no religion, political leaders will be land grabbers and so forth. I think atheism, theism is irrelevant. If all that was gone, dictators would still rise, people would still try to get power, and I think anyway, that's my opinion on that.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question for you. Just really quickly, is your daughter, is she a Christian? Does she believe in God?
She's a Christian. She believes in God.
Okay. Let's say that she grows up to be a teenager and really strongly has a strong faith for God. But what if she became attracted to women because that's how she truly felt? How would you feel? Do you think that God would really not love her, or do you feel that you would lose some love for her?
I would answer both those questions no.
Can I answer that for you? That's what I'm talking about.
Pardon?
Can I answer that for you?
You want to answer it for me? You can answer it for yourself.
Well, the reason
I'm not sure where you're going with this, but I would say no. I don't believe I would lose any love for her, and I don't think God would either.
Well, the reason I ask
Again, I'm sorry. Please, just ask your question, and it's not really time to
do you
dialogue.
love the sinner but hate the sin?
I mean, I try to not let my. I think there's something in our nature that loves good and dislikes evil. That's not just me. I think we all feel this way. The revolutionary aspect of Christianity is not to say that. Aristotle would have agreed. In fact, Aristotle says it is impossible to love a bad man, because how can you love badness in a man? Christ gives a different answer, and that is, Christ says, don't stop hating the badness, but love the man anyway. So you're turning a love doctrine into a hate doctrine. The love doctrine is the doctrine that separates the sin from the sinner instead of saying, here's a man who did bad things, I'm going to strike a compromise. I'm going to not dislike the badness so much, because it's, after all, a good guy. Christ says, no, dislike the badness completely, but then also love the guy completely. I mean, that seems to me to be a beautiful doctrine that separates the bad action from the inner worth of the person.
Thank you.
All right, my question is directed towards Dr. Shermer. And as a Christian male, As a Christian male, I like that you brought the Bible up, and this is on homosexuality. I find revealed in the Bible that mankind, that I myself am fallen, that all of nature, all of creation is fallen. And so therefore I am unable to look at it as an example to put out the premise of how I should live, or what I should do, or what is normal. That God has revealed himself and revealed that I was created for a woman, and that woman was created for man, and that in my revelation of him being my creator, I, out of love, respond to his purpose for me.
If you could get to your question, please.
My question for you is, how do you see there being able to have as you said, that homosexuality someday will be a part of the church, when very clearly the whole issue of homosexuality in the church is that it is outside of the purpose of the Creator, of the purpose of the creation. That you can never reconcile those two, because it's been, as a Christian, I believe it's been stated that is not our purpose.
Well, I was pretty clear on this. I mean, you're basing this entirely on one single passage.
No, Romans 1:20 through 27 talks about the corruptible nature of mankind, of man, but even of creation. That
I'm just talking
to
about
say that
just
an
talking about
animal, a
homosexuality
form, well, look at
as a sin.
All right,
I
let Dr. Shermer
I mean, you're basing this entire thing on this one passage. That homosexuality is that a man shall not lie with a man. That's it. Leviticus. That's all you get.
Can I read one?
And no, because it won't say that. Well, I don't consider homosexuality bad. What's bad about it? Well, I mean, if you get married to a woman, how does some other same-sex couple, how does that hurt you? What do you care what they do? These are consenting adults. We're not talking about polygamous 13-year-olds and 50-year-old guys. Just consenting adults. What do you care what they do in their bedroom? Why is that your business? Mind your own business.
I'm going to have to cut you off, but thank you for your question. Dinesh, would you care to
Well,
respond?
I have a thought, but I'll come back to it. In the interest of time, I don't mind moving on.
And over here, on my right.
Okay, you stated that the worldview of rationality derived from Christianity. Could you explain further exactly how that developed from Christianity? You didn't explain that.
The question is about how do we get this sort of idea of a rational universe from Christianity. The idea of the rational universe was actually first thought of by the pre-Socratics. The pre-Socratics, if you go back to Thales and so on, they had this sort of idea that the universe is in some ways coherent. Look at Thales, he says everything is water. Now, if you think about it, this is crazy. How can everything be water? But what Thales is saying is behind the superficial diversity of the world, there is a kind of single entity, namely water. He was wrong about what the entity was, but he had a kind of insight, which is that perhaps there is an underlying something that explains the manifest diversity of everything. So the pre-Socratics were onto something, but in a sense Socrates came along and said, listen guys, you're talking too much about nature, let's talk about human nature. And we see a big shift in philosophy away from nature and toward human nature. In the medieval era, this notion of the rational universe is picked up, but it's given a much deeper and more elaborate foundation. And the idea here is that the universe is rational because God is not only omnipotent, which is powerful, but omniscient. Omniscient means all-knowing. So the universe is going to reflect to some degree, the creation will reflect the creator. The universe shows those traces or signatures of divine rationality. This is what the medieval Christians believed. You can read it in Augustine, you can read it in Boethius, you can read it in many of the medieval thinkers. And that's why you have the invention of theology. Theology is an effort to give rational meaning to the universe. If you go into Islam, you don't find an equivalent to theology. Even in Judaism, you have jurisprudence, Maimonides, the disputations of the meaning of the Torah, but nothing resembling Christian theology to use human reason to intuit the purposes of God in the rational universe. What I'm getting at is the medieval Christians developed this edifice. And modern science didn't grow out of a rebellion against Christianity, it grew out of a debate within two strains within Christianity. My new book, What's So Great About Christianity, traces this history. There was an inductive strain in theology, and then there was a deductive strain. You can think of Aquinas as reflecting the inductive, and you can think of Anselm as reflecting the deductive. You see this even in their arguments for God's existence. Modern science draws on that tradition to develop the idea of the rational universe, and the scientists saw themselves as physicians. I mean, Copernicus was a deacon in the cathedral and said, I wanted to become a theologian, but I became an astronomer pretty much for the same reason, to demonstrate the rationality of God in the universe. There's a whole literature on this. Newton wrote more on scripture than he wrote about science, and he hadn't read Richard Dawkins' book, I guess. He didn't know that these two things were totally contradictory.
I have a response to this.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that chapter in your book is one of the best. It's the best chapter in your book on the Galileo stuff. But you didn't take it far enough. Yes, the rational world comes from these two strands, Athens and Jerusalem, let's say. I think you got all that right from a historian of science point of view. But in the middle of the scientific revolution, you talked about Galileo and Kepler and Copernicus, but there was also William Harvey and Vesalius and Gilbert on magnets and so on. What it was a battle of the books. the book of nature and the book of authority. The book of authority was both Athens and Jerusalem. It was Aristotle and Aquinas. And what the scientific revolution was revolting against was that if you actually go out into nature and look to see if it really is that way, whether the authority comes from church or from a secular source like Athens or Jerusalem, it doesn't matter. We still have to go out and check. It's the empirical nature of science that I think was so revolutionary.
Yeah, just a very brief thought. A very brief thought about Galileo, because it illuminates this whole controversy. See, today when we read the Galileo thing, we think, oh, Galileo was right, the church was wrong. I would submit that this is what can be called a retroactive fallacy. We know today that we live in a heliocentric system. We know today that Galileo was right. That was not known in Galileo's time. The best astronomers in the world did not agree with Galileo. Galileo made arguments for the heliocentric system, but his arguments were often wrong. He thought that you could prove the fact that the Earth moved around the sun by looking at the tides. He actually had a completely wrong understanding of heliocentrism. When he came before Cardinal Bellarmine said to Galileo what I consider to be an eminently reasonable scientific statement. He said, Galileo, you could be right. He said, but the fact is, we don't know. The evidence is inconclusive. If you can show me a demonstrative proof that the Earth goes around the sun, I think it is only reasonable for the church to admit that we have been understanding Scripture in the wrong way. There is no possibility that the book of nature and the book of Scripture can be in conflict. So if you show me real proofs that you're right, we will revise our interpretation of the Bible in line with your demonstrations. But since you don't have these demonstrations, underline, therefore we are in a position that it is better to preserve the ancient teaching until the evidence comes into the contrary. This, I would suggest, is an absolutely sensible model, not only of church doctrine, but of pedagogy. You're teaching something, it's been established for a long time, common sense supports it. In other words, when you throw an object in the air, if the Earth is moving at thousands of miles an hour, it would seem to land at a different spot. So it wasn't just that the Bible said, human evidence seemed to support Ptolemy. The Galileo controversy shows us, if we will read it modestly, that there's a lot of arrogance on both sides. This was a case where ultimately Galileo was vindicated, but only a generation later. That's when the evidence did come in, and that's when Galileo was shown to be correct.
That was one heck of a question. I appreciate that for two reasons. One, it was terse, and two, it brought about such a book on this end of things. Please make your questions equally terse if you can. Next question.
Mr. Shermer, you said repeatedly that the Bible only says that homosexuality is wrong in one passage. That is factually incorrect.
Whatever. Yeah.
Well, no, not whatever. It's important to be factually correct in a debate, is it not?
I don't care. If there's 2 places or 3 places, it says stoning to death.
So were you factually correct or were you not factually correct? Have you ever read the document in its entirety?
The Bible? Oh, yeah.
Let's look at that.
Anyway, go ahead. I mean, so whether it says
were you
stoning to
aware
death,
that there are
look, I don't care if it says executing adulterers 27 times. That's still wrong.
Let's stop. Dr. Shermer,
well, I mean, you brought it up, so
the question has that enough.
So were you also aware that about the surest way to reduce your life expectancy is to be gay? Did you know that?
Dr. Shermer, please, you don't have to respond to it. This is not a time for dialogue, sir. I'm sorry, but I think he can respond to your first question.
But he did get a question about
and let's leave it there.
Aware that the surest way to reduce your life expectancy is to be gay. One of the surest ways.
That's it. I'm sorry, sir. You don't know.
Actually, the surest way is
Check it out. You'd be surprised.
is smoking. So I'm sure somewhere in the Bible it says thou shalt not smoke.
Well,
Let me give a better answer to that. It doesn't matter if it says it once, twice, 3 times. Why is it wrong?
What matters if you claim it only mentioned it once?
Well, that's not what I say.
Mike, I'm going to come to your defense here in this way. We're seeing here a little bit of the difficulty of having a debate like this one, and I think it's this, and that is that